Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with another Greenskin Q&A. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into it. Our first question today comes from TheSilverEminence, who asks, what exactly did the Chaos Dwarves do to the Orcs that caused their transformation into Black Orks? Also, how would a typical Orc compare in terms of fighting ability to a typical warrior/soldier from each of the other races? So, for the first part, the Chaos Dwarves use some extremely dangerous and twisted sorceries to warp the spores that create new greenskins. They seem to use, we know that they use their own twisted magics, so they used, they basically unleash some forms of demonic sorcery and their own unique magics, because they have access to a unique lore, for instance, called the Lore of Hashut, which is very much about fire and brimstone and all that crazy stuff. But I would say that the Chaos Dwarves don't go super into depth about how they created them, mostly because they've purged a lot of that information to make sure it doesn't happen again. But the nitty-gritty details are they use their skills at demonic summoning and reshaping, and their ability at basically purifying a material by infusing it with hatred and malice until they basically took an orc and they not only increased its size, but they also removed all distractions from its consciousness. They just made them into these really hateful creatures that are not easily distracted and are hyper-focused, which was ultimately their undoing. So that's kind of the most detailed it gets into it. It's very vague, just because the Dawizar are not fond of that colossal failure, so they don't have a lot of great records on it. There's literally just a couple of sentences that give very broad statements about give broad statements guessing at what kind of actions they performed. As for the second part of the question, when comparing against typical soldiers of other armies, orcs are without a doubt one of the toughest and largest basic troops you will find in the entire world. They're not at the highest of the chart, but when it comes to like sheer toughness, they're pretty much tied with Saurus warriors. Due to the heavy armor and their superior skill at combat, Chaos Warriors are a little bit higher in the toughness category. But when it comes to just taking a hit, they are one of the toughest creatures in the world. And in the old world, they are, for typical troops, I should say. For just like your basic troops, they're up there in the top, I would say the top 5. You know, there are a few species that can threaten them that are also basic troops: Saurus warriors, dryads, chaos warriors and dwarves when it comes to just sheer toughness. But the thing about orc physiology that makes them rather dangerous is that orcs have when orcs get really excited and they're like just going all in on a fight and they have the wall on their mind and they're focused on combat, orcs are notorious for not realizing that they're dead, is the way they're described, which pretty much just means that they're so caught up in their frenzy that they don't notice the fact that they've taken mortal damage. So, you know, where most warriors might be like trying to hold their intestines in, or maybe would immediately collapse due to blood loss or something, an orc will keep swinging until they are brain dead. Which is what makes them so dangerous compared to most average troops. Hopefully that answers that. Next up is DatOrkBoss again, who asks, do greenskins change based on where they're located? I know that some orcs in the Badlands are almost treated like any other race, or another race entirely due to their insanity, the Savage Orcs. Would an army of greenskins marauding Cathay look different from a horde in the Darklands, Norsca, the Empire, and all the other regions they live in? So, when it comes to purely physical differences between regions, it's very, very subtle. But culturally, there are very large differences between greenskin locations. So, the example you gave, the orcs in the Badlands it's a little more nuanced than that. The common orc of the Badlands are what we just know as orcs. You know, they tend to wear leather, lighter materials. Maybe they'll have like a metal shoulder pad, or they might even have notable metal armor if they're particularly wealthy, at least when it comes to loot. Savage Orcs you can find Savage Orcs almost anywhere you can find orcs. So the Badlands, there are a lot of Savage Orcs, but there are also a lot of regular orcs. And it is a cultural divide, but it's not one caused by geography per se. Sometimes it is. Most of the time, though, it's more of exposure to proper technologies or loot. So if you go over down to the Southlands, or you go over to the jungles of Lustria, you're almost going to find pure Savage Orcs, because they never got access to the orc smiths that came out of Zarnagrund, and they don't tend to fight armies that use metals that they can easily adapt to their own bodies, because there's very few dwarves down there, and there's very few heavy machined, there's very few heavily plated warriors of chaos or heavily plated war machines that you might find in the Empire. You know, all they're fighting a lot of the time is lizardmen, tomb kings, or dark elves, so those races don't really offer a lot for those orcs, so they tend to be Savage Orcs due to resources, not due to purely their environment. As for the Cathay question, though, a orc horde coming out of Cathay, of course there would be likely to be some Savage Orc tribes over there, but a orc horde coming out of Cathay would actually be very unique, probably due to their equipment. Because orcs tend to loot from whatever they're fighting, and they pick up equipment from that force, and if they can use it, they will. They can't always. But the greenskins coming out of the Orient would likely be very unique, very bizarre. I imagine they would have very sophisticated weapons, and their armor would probably be considered light armor, just because the Cathayans obviously don't have, massive engines of war made out of steel. They don't have heavy gromro plate or anything like that. I would not at all be surprised to find out the Cathayans have like some kind of unique material. They might turn out to have, I know this is a Japanese thing, but they might have like 1,000-folded steel or something like that. But of course, whatever would fit China's lore. But if they would probably take what they would find and apply it to themselves, but it would probably have mixed results. But the orc smiths who left Zarnagrund definitely would have gone east, some of them. So they wouldn't just be Savage Orcs. They would be, as far as orcs go, pretty sophisticated, and would be capable of having some really interesting fighting styles and tactics that would be wildly different from their western kin. But mostly it would manifest in their armor and weapon choices, as they would probably mimic their opponents. So hopefully that answers that. For the most part, we don't really know what that would be like, just because we don't know that much about Cathay in the first place. We got another question from Cat59 here, who asks, what can you tell us about the Goblin trader tribes? Trader is in like trading. Do they trade with humans / non-greenskins? If so, what would they trade? Is it then possible / feasible for other greenskins to become mercenaries and fight for other races? Would they then still be attacked by groups like Sigmarites or Dwarves, or is the situation bizarre enough to warrant not killing them on sight? So, there are tons of Goblin trader tribes. Well, in the global scale of things, they're very rare. But if you're looking specifically at the old world, there's a fair amount of them, because you'll find a ton of Goblin traders in the Wolflands, and Gorfang's lads down in Blackcrag. They're considered rather peculiar among their kind, because they're actually willing to... They tend to be the kind of greenskins that you can actively bribe for safe passage, and they will actually stick to their word, because they like accumulating wealth, which wasn't always the case in the Wolflands, but there's a story about that for another day. But, the thing about them is that, A, nobody really trusts them, which is why every trade caravan that takes the Silk Road, does two big things when they're traveling through Greenskin lands. You bring something that you know the Greenskins will like to bribe them with, and you hire big, scary ogre mercenary bodyguards, and probably an entire mercenary company from like Tilia or the Border Princes or the Empire, so that nobody messes with you. You know, you have like your own private army, which is what the Dogs of War, like if you boil down the Dogs of War to how they would be correctly represented in a Total War Warhammer type setting, the true Dogs of War would basically be those mercenary companies hired from the likes of the Southern Realms. And, you know, and then very famous mercenary races like maybe mercenary dwarves, mercenary ogres, stuff like that, so they can get through those lands. But as far as, and that's so they just don't get double crossed when they pay them off. As far as what I can tell you about them, the notable thing is that all goblin trader tribes are always wolf tribes. So they are always common goblins that are wolf riders. Always. Because those are the only ones that can cover enough distance over open terrain so that they can stay mobile and safe despite having large amounts of loot. Because they'll usually build up these like massive chariots that are pulled by a ton of wolves where they keep all their big stuff. And they'll usually run around picking up loot, you know, attacking people that come onto their lands, all that stuff. And then they will eventually work their way back to wherever their base is. So, you know, if you're dealing with Gorfang's lads, they run around the Badlands and Mad Dog Pass and Death Pass collecting bribes and tributes from either other tribes while also doing scouting and stuff like that. And then once they've done their rounds, they head back to Black Crag to turn in stuff. But as for do they trade, Greenskins very rarely trade. Some tribes engage with it with one another, but when it comes to non-greenskins, it is super rare. They might trade with a race they don't they consider someone they'd like to fight, but maybe someone they're not always fighting, but is always around, like Skaven or ogres. I would say Skaven and ogres trade a fair amount with greenskins. And some tribes, especially out in the Wolflands, even specialize in capturing people. Like they'll capture people alive, they'll capture monsters, they'll capture anything living they can, and they'll take it to the Chaos Dwarves and trade them for like weapons and armor. So there are actually a number of goblin trader tribes who are actually slave traders, and it's only so they can trade with the Chaos Dwarves. But as far as humans, I would say no. I don't think there's ever successfully been a trade agreement between humans and orcs or greenskins, but especially not goblins. And as for the last part of the question, if a Sigmarite or a dwarf saw a greenskin, it is a kill on sight situation 100% of the time. There is never ever been a goblin or orc that a dwarf or a Sigmarite has looked at and been like, maybe not this one. If they can, they will go for the kill 100% of the time. It's just too deeply ingrained. Most humans will go in for the kill on a greenskin if they get the chance. There might be some that don't want to risk it or would rather sneak around, but especially the religions that have a very storied history against greenskins, like Myrmidia, Sigmar, or those two in particular, they're gonna go after them. Alright, next up is Shirley the Bandit, who asks, first says, thanks for all the lore of the years. You're welcome. Do the orcs ever use any warpstone for weapons or fuel? No. And the reason is that warpstone is way too dangerous for greenskins, especially for their own taste. Greenskins cannot even touch warpstone without extreme risk of mutation. The only exception to that are very stupid and ambitious shamans who might know that they can use warpstone, or weird stone as some people call it, to augment their magical powers. But that's kind of all wizards, not just greenskin wizards, and it's even for wizards, it's very risky. The only greenskin I know of who has ever purposefully interacted with warpstone is Skarsnik, because he realized that the Skaven really like warpstone, and he found like a big chunk of it. So he purposefully mined it and traded warpstone shards to the Skaven in exchange for favors or, you know, weapons and stuff like that. But for most greenskins, absolutely not. Way too dangerous. Like, you can literally just grab it and your fingers will turn into worms or tentacles or something. Especially greenskins. Greenskins seem more vulnerable to it than most races. I'm not sure why necessarily that would be the case. It might have to do with their physiology, but for greenskins, warpstone is very, very deadly and dangerous. So 99.9 to the infinite amount of them will not mess with it. It's the second they realize what it is, because they don't understand how to use it. So for them, it's just a massive risk for very, very low reward. Next up, Tolerant Cactus asks, do the greenskins ever repurpose or reuse some of the more advanced weapons and tech they take from the dwarves? In all the lost holds, while much is hidden and blocked off, there must still be a treasure trove of goodies for them to play with. If they do, what's the most advanced thing they've ever gotten working again? Love the channel, keep up the awesome work. Thank you. So, greenskins repurpose and reuse stuff they take from other races all the time. Now, when it comes to more advanced weapons, their success has been pretty limited, because most greenskins' first reaction to some new toy is to hit it with something really, really hard, so they usually break it, unfortunately. But there have been instances where the greenskins have successfully managed to get something working. Now, I should say, when I think advanced weapons and tech, I assume you mean something that's at least as sophisticated as a war machine or a rifle. When it comes to guns, the only greenskin that's ever used a gun on purpose were the greenskins that were under the control of the Sleeper, which was the main antagonist of the Gotrek and Felix book, Orc Slayer, which we've talked about a bit in prior videos, because there were a couple questions about it, because it's a very interesting creature. It's kind of like a giant, bloated, mutated ant queen that was capable of controlling greenskins like drones, and it was a very smart creature, and it took over a dwarf hold and basically broke open their weapon stashes, their armories, and armed the greenskins with guns. And because it could control them all perfectly, it was able to just use them. Like, there were firing lines of greenskins, and it made that hold virtually impregnable. Like, it took Gotrek and Felix with a full dwarf throng behind them to even stand a chance of getting in the doors. Gotrek should have died due to one of those firing squads, but because he's got, you know, the plot armor of the gods, he managed to survive. And those greenskins were terrifying. But as far as what's like been the worst scenario, there's actually a specific story about it in the Imperial year of 2470, which is about it's about 30 years before, 40 years, about 45 years before Total War Warhammer starts. Actually, sorry, make that like, yeah, that's about right. There was a war boss named Bogrub Legbiter. Now, whether Bogrub was an orc or a shaman or a goblin is difficult to say. I believe he was an orc, but he was the leader of the Broken Nose tribe at the time. And they got into a big fight with Karak-Azul, and they defeated Karak-Azul's dwarves and captured a bunch of their war machines. We're talking organ guns, cannons, bolt throwers. Like, they captured all those goodies. And the terrifying thing was, normally dwarf holds are really, really good about putting runes on their war machines so that if they're in danger of getting captured, they activate the rune and it causes the war machine to explode, to self-destruct. But apparently Karak-Azul either didn't have those runes on those weapons or didn't have time to activate them. So not only did he manage to get these war machines working, but he managed to keep them working. So Bogrub and the Broken Nose tribe took their dwarf war machines, and with them were able to go north through the entire World's Edge Mountains undefeated, because they had these sophisticated weapons to just explode other enemy greenskin tribes or cause, harass dwarves with their own sophisticated weaponry. How they had enough ammunition is a mystery. But they managed to successfully work their way up the World's Edge Mountains until they got to... They basically went up and started coming towards the Border Princes through the mountains until they eventually popped out of the mountains and they went all the way to Averland. And they made it all the way to Averland from Karak Azul, which Karak Azul is way down south in the Badlands. Well, technically in the World's Edge Mountains. But they made that ridiculous journey all the way to Averland before they were defeated by the Empire. Either because they ran out of ammunition or the Empire just managed to finally take them down somehow. So it has happened, and every time it's happened, it's been really, really bad. But thankfully, it is super rare. Just because greenskins are a very destructive race that have a very hard time not only using advanced weaponry and tech, but, keeping it working. Hopefully it answers that question. Next up, we've got a question from Metak4, who asks, why is the greenskin face flag not green? Would it be possible to annihilate the race of greenskins, and how do greenskins use magic? So, the first question, it's kind of more of a design question than a lore question, but if you're referring to the greenskin flag in Total War, where it's the symbol of the red face, that is a symbol of the Bloody Sun, which is a very famous greenskin icon painted over all their banners, armor, shields, etc. And a ton of characters have it represented on their armor. Grimgor has it, Gorfang Rockgut has it, and it, of course, represents the sun, which, as a majority of the greenskin race live in burning wastelands, is not quite worshipped as a entity or deity, but it's more of they acknowledge it as a very brutal and punishing creature or being, because when it's out, it just beats down on them. As for the icon, it simply represents the tribe in question, which the greenskin banner we have in Total War Warhammer, I usually refer to this particular banner as the Bloody Sun Boys, which is a reference to Warhammer Online, which Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning was an MMO game that came out like maybe 10, 15 years ago. And ran for about, it was like 15 years ago. Man, I'm getting old. But unfortunately, it didn't last super duper long. But that was the name. Every one of the playable races had like a faction they were part of, and the greenskin faction, you were the Bloody Sun Boys, who had a very similar banner. And so that's what I call Grimgor's tribe in the Total War Warhammer. Like, that's what I would say that flag refers to, is the Bloody Sun Boys or some variant close to that. So that's a very fitting name, though technically the image is just a really generic image among greenskins. In the more recent books, I don't believe, maybe in the 7th edition book, but I know for a fact in the 8th edition book, that particular symbol, although it shows up a bunch in the lore and on models that Games Workshop has made, it doesn't actually correlate to a specific tribe. It's just the Bloody Sun. So that's why the green flag is not green. It's because it's not an orc face, it's the sun. Let's see, next up is to answer your question about why you don't see green banners normally for greenskins, once again, kind of a design thing, but I feel like that would be like if humans used flesh-colored symbols for our banners. Like, it just kind of looks weird, right? That may not necessarily be the reason. Maybe green pigment is hard to come across for greenskins, but I always feel like if a race has a banner that's the same color they are, it just kind of looks weird a lot of the time. Like, maybe if it's the same color of your armor, sure, but You know, if there were a bunch of humans running around with a bunch of banners the color of their skin, and it wasn't because, you know, they were like literally holding a banner that was made of a person, then I think it would look a little silly. As for the other questions, would it be possible to annihilate the greenskins? No. I think I already went over this in a prior video, but the TLDR is the Lizardmen put in an insane global effort to wipe out the greenskins and weren't able to pull it off. And how do greenskins use magic? So, like most races in the Warhammer world, the greenskins have an impact on the winds of magic with their beliefs and their thoughts. However, unlike most races, the greenskins have such comically fervent and fanatical energy when gathered in large groups that they begin to have a very exponential impact on the winds, especially when they're fighting. The shamans among the tribes are able to channel these raging tempestuous winds stirred up by the greenskins getting all amped up and getting all fired up, and the shamans call this the Great Green, and they unleash it, which comes out as spells to devastating effect. Though this comes severely at the cost of the shamans in question's sanity, and they have very strange tics, like they either talk to themselves, they have split personalities, they like tweak their head every couple of minutes, or they do all sorts of weird stuff. And that's assuming that they don't accidentally try and unleash too much power at once, which that has to go through them as a conduit, and their heads just don't like pop, you know. So that's how they use magic. They don't use like true priestly prayers, which it may seem like they used in some perspectives due to the fact they have shamans. They use true magic, but theirs is unique because it's more of like their armies and their lads build it up and almost kind of builds a spiritual connection to Gork and Mork, which stirs the winds of magic up into a frenzy, and then the greenskin shamans grab that and throw it at you. But depending on the way they do that, shapes the spell so it has its various effects. So hopefully that answers that question. Next up, we have a question from Dean Lomas, I think, that asks, great videos, really enjoyed the Q&A, glad you are. Who is my favorite greenskin? My personal favorite is Gorfang Rotgut, the Squatter King of Blackcrag and the war boss of the Red Fangs tribe, also known as the Troll Eater because he really, really likes hunting down and eating trolls. And then I think today's last question is going to come in from Inquisitor Thomas, who asks, who is the best, Gork or Mork? Well, that's a really silly question. Obviously, Gork, or maybe Mork, is the best. I always get them mixed up. It's hard to tell. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you tomorrow for next episode. Have a good day. Bye.